Welcome back to another episode of the Twin Elements podcast, proudly presented by Venture Hunting and Outdoors. If you're like us and passionate about hunting, spearfishing, and many other outdoor-related pursuits, with an eagerness to fast-track your learning, then this podcast is perfect for you. Welcome back to another episode of the Twin Elements podcast. We are your hosts, James and Ayden Doumtsis, and today we will be diving into probably what is one of the most debated topics surrounding the consumption of wild game meats that we hunt and obviously kill here in Australia. We're focusing largely on feral pigs and deer, and to be honest, we think that there's a bit of a stigma and bad perception issue surrounding eating these critters. What we're going to be doing is we will identify and list certain bacteria and other organisms which can infect these animals and importantly cause diseases in humans under certain circumstances. We're then going to run you through the very true and apparent risks of eating these wild animals, mainly to make you aware that they do exist. And then we'll go through step by step to help you reduce your anxiety around these issues and basically understand how to safely mitigate those risks. Whilst we live and breathe this sort of stuff in our daily professions as veterinarians, and also obviously through the films that we produce and the way that we hunt, we eat majority of the animals that we hunt, particularly, wild pork, wild goat, venison, buffalo in the form of beef, all these sort of delicious wild game meats. It is worth saying that this episode is simply a guide, I guess, to wild game meat and the diseases that they can have. This podcast should only act as a thought provoker and a basis for your meat harvesting plans and desires. Everything mentioned within this podcast should really be diligently fact-checked by you guys as well, because, we might say something that obviously we think we're saying it a certain way, but then say it slightly incorrectly or that needs fact-checking or, just clarification. Obviously, having the veterinary background, it does help to try and understand this a little bit better. So we just want to ensure that, you have peace of mind when feeding wild game to your friends and family. The topics discussed in today's episode are going to be the diseases specific to deer and wild pigs, tips on field dressing and hygiene practices, refrigeration and freezing strategies, and then cooking guidelines. And what you will come to learn from this episode is that cooking is the king, and hitting those temperatures, minimum required temperatures, is going to be what's most important when it comes to ensuring safety. We're also going to touch on some FAQs. As always, we love getting in your listener questions, so please send them through to info@twinelements.com.au with the subject outline FAQs. And feel free to send us Instagram DMs or on any of our social media. We do also see all of your YouTube comments. Make sure you're sending any Instagram DMs to Ayden Doumtsis Outdoors, James Doumtsis Outdoors, or the main Twin Elements account. Without further ado, we will get into the podcast. We hope you enjoy this one.
Venture Hunting and Outdoors is Australia's premier hunting retailer, with the mission to give Australian outdoorsmen and women the resource they deserve. Venture started from a team of passionate hunters and has transformed into a community. Through group events, top quality gear, exclusive deals, and expert guidance, Venture is more than a hunting store. Check out their website today to see what epic deals are available. Well, legends, before we jump into this podcast, I just wanted to reiterate what Ayden said in the introduction. So obviously, we're just going to run through all the infectious diseases that commonly or potentially infect us, I guess, through eating wild game. But we just wanted to sort of put a disclaimer out there. We take no responsibility for how you process your wild game. This is purely meant to be taken, as strategies, I guess, for how we process and what we do. But you should really go out there and do your own information. And there are so many variables when it comes to eating wild game, especially with how it's cooked and the processing of it and whatnot. So once again, we take zero responsibility for how you consume your wild game, and you should do your own information. We're just going to share with you some of our veterinary knowledge, obviously, on these diseases, and then the strategies that we use to mitigate those infectious diseases so that we try and make our wild game as safe as possible. So without further ado, we'll jump into the first one, which is brucellosis. So brucellosis, we mainly get from wild pigs. So it's one that you get, essentially you can get it from multiple ways. You can get it through blood commonly, but also urine as well. And that's from when you've got like cuts and whatnot on your hands. So the first way is through the butchering process. And then the next most likely way is through consuming, wild pork that hasn't been cooked properly. So what we're going to do is we're going to jump through all the actual diseases, I guess, explain them and the symptoms and stuff that cause them, and then actually go through how to prevent them. But going back to brucellosis, the symptoms that you normally get if you do contract it, so you get fever, really bad joint pain, sweating, and it can develop into chronic illnesses in humans. So it's quite a terrible one. I know a few mates that have had it and been hospitalized, needed to be on severe antibiotics and fluids. It is quite nasty, and they've just got that purely from blood, and not washing their hands afterwards and eating after, chopping up wild pork. It is also one to consider if you're a pig dogger, because dogs can contract it as well. So from a veterinary point of view, we've actually treated dogs in hospitals with this as well. And that mainly is to do with them consuming the blood of wild pork and stuff like that. And also consuming like uncooked pork, meat and stuff like that you've fed to your dogs. So from a human point of view, when it comes from, a basic first line principle of preventing getting it, we obviously recommend you wearing gloves, so you've got that barrier there, but also really importantly, making sure you're thoroughly washing your hands before you consume anything, before you touch your mouth. If you've got any like ulcers on your hands or cuts or anything like that on your hand, definitely making sure that you're preferably wearing gloves, but really, really, really like thoroughly wash your hands afterwards. And especially if you're seeing like a swollen penis or pizzle in a boar or something like that, or swollen testes, I'd definitely be concerned that pig's got brucellosis. And this is like spread rife all through like pig populations within Australia. So this is definitely one that, if you're out there eating wild pork all the time, not to say that, like I said, like we eat wild pork all the time. I actually think that wild pork's way better than the domestic pork that we consume here. And so, obviously there's risks around that, and that's where managing these risks is really important, and why we're so passionate about doing this podcast and sharing this information and educating everyone. But, with pigs especially, there is a lot of diseases you can contract. And so making sure that you're covering yourself and protecting yourself in the best way possible is really important, and making sure wearing gloves, washing hands and cooking your meat properly is going to help prevent brucellosis.
A few things I wanted to touch on there is just to reiterate that wild pigs certainly are like the known reservoir, but deer can also be infected. It is just much less likely. And definitely reiterate on the topic of, I do think of it a lot more of like a pig hunter disease, because I think when you shoot an animal such as a wild boar with the bow, the risk is still obviously there, but a lot of that blood and things like that ends up on the ground because you're separated from that animal when you shoot it, same as with rifle hunters. And then a lot of the time you'll go over there, you might roll it over, and a lot of guys will take photos and that's about it with it. Like they might touch the hair and things like that, but they're not necessarily getting too in contact with the blood, urine, all these liquids that then get spread through to your cuts on your hands and things. Whereas pig doggers, I think what makes it more of a disease with those sort of people is that you're obviously hunting very close contact with the pig. You're stabbing it through, the vitals, the heart, lungs, and that blood is pouring out onto your hands, potentially onto your dogs. Your dogs have got blood all over their face, mouth, you're patting your dogs. It's just a lot more close contact. And obviously the risk therefore increases. So again, having, if you do pig dog and you go, oh, that does sound like a bit of a risk, you could shoot them with a rifle, like, call your dogs, have bailing dogs rather than lugging dogs, all these sorts of things. They're just some considerations. But again, like nothing, it's the aim of this podcast is to just raise awareness on it. It's one of those things that everything in life has risks, so it's just trying to reduce them and mitigate them as best as possible. The next disease that we'll cover is Q fever, which a lot of people may have actually heard of. It's carried by a lot of wild animals throughout Australia, also domestic animals such as cattle, sheep, most animals that basically have associated with outdoors. So dust, dirt, animal particles in the form of urine, blood, fecal matter, even birthing fluids. And to be honest, a lot of this means that more commonly farmers are actually at risk. I remember, for example, to become a veterinarian, we were advised in first year of uni that we'd have to get our Q fever vaccination. So that is good. There is a vaccination for people that are high risk individuals, and it's available should you want it. But otherwise, again, just become aware for it, because whilst it's not too severe, it can cause flu-like illness in humans, and severer cases may lead to things like pneumonia or chronic fatigue, as it is like an inhaled aerosol quite often. So again, people working in dusty outdoor settings, and obviously hunters, where we're field dressing animals and exposed to those sort of particles.
Yeah, I definitely think it's one of these things that I'd actually like outside of the podcast realm a bit, I guess. Like if you're a farmer or, maybe even a stock agent or, work in a sale yard somewhere or, anything, whatever, abattoirs, anything like that. Like if you're working around livestock and domestic animals, I'd definitely recommend getting vaccinated for it. I once again, know people within the industry that have been affected by it. And yeah, you do get really, potentially get really, really bad chronic fatigue, actually mess your life up, chronic fatigue, where one of my really good lecturer friends, she had it, was still battling it for years, over 20 years, after contracting it. So that's why obviously Ayden and I had to get vaccinated at uni. But yeah, I'd recommend it's one of these things prevention's definitely better than cure. So going out and getting vaccinated for it and not having to worry about it in the future, definitely a high recommendation from us.
So most people may have heard of leptospirosis. This is a bacteria that is quite common in a range of wild animals, including feral pigs and deer. Essentially with leptospirosis, you want to know that it's transmitted through urine or contaminated water. So if you think fluids, that's most common with when it comes to lepto. Less likely through direct contact with infected animals through physical contact and that sort of thing. Quite alarmingly, some studies have said that up to 20% of feral pigs in Queensland can have leptospirosis. So that's, 1 in 5 pigs, obviously. If you're doing a fair bit of feral pig hunting, then that does increase your risk, to the disease. And this one can cause severe illness in humans, most commonly seen as fever, muscle pain, and then kidney failure. And then again, that's something that we see represented quite clearly in the veterinary industry with domestic animals. So I've personally treated dogs over in the Northern Territory following floods and things like that. Leptospirosis can also be transmitted from feral animals and things like that, but also in pests such as rats and mice. So if you live in sort of the tropical areas where there's floods and water and all these different contaminants, including urine, as we've mentioned, then just trying to keep your animals away from that too can reduce disease transmission. And I know for dogs, for example, there are vaccines for dogs, but for humans, we do see flu-like symptoms as well, with muscle pain and chills being most common. But as I said earlier, it can develop into more severe things like kidney failure, which is never good.
Yeah, it's one of these things that if you live in the tropics and stuff like that, and especially if you're a pig dogger or something like that, it's probably something I'd recommend you vaccinate your dogs for. As well, just once again, prevention better than cure, in the sense that obviously contaminated water, most of the time I think of pig dogs or even us hunting pigs and stuff, you're along swamps, huge risk there obviously. And it's one of these things the vaccine, I don't know what it costs, but it's not overly expensive in the sense of what it would actually cost to to treat your dog with lepto, let alone the risk of potentially losing one of your pets and or one of your dogs that you put a lot of time into as well. So something to touch base on with your local veterinarian. I don't know if there's a human-based vaccine and stuff, but with this, it's more just handling. Obviously trying to you should never aspire to pop the bladder when you're butchering an animal, and obviously when getting it from contaminated water and stuff like that, and vermin and everything like that. So obviously trying not to handle rodents, and you sort of pick where you wash your hands and all that type of thing. Have a bit of sterility about you, and be clean, and you should be right from a human perspective. But definitely from a dog perspective, it'd be worth getting vaccinated.
Specialising in high-quality supplements and nutrition, from electrolytes and hydration add-ins to their wild bars, Atlas Wild helps to fuel our outdoor adventures. Their Regenerate lineup has been a game-changer whilst hunting up north in the heat and humidity. It's perfect for those on the quest for hydration when losing lots of sweat. With grape, lemon lime, blue raspberry and orange flavours, there's something for everyone. Another favourite of mine is their Fusion lineup. It's my go-to for rest and recovery towards the end of a day. It's perfect for a big pack out. Now available in peach iced tea and lemon lime flavours. When shopping on the Atlas Wild website, be sure to use code TWIN10, that's TWIN 10 numerically, for 10% off your next order.
The next one is Toxoplasma gondii, or toxoplasmosis. So this is a parasite infection that mainly actually the primary host is actually cats. So in the life cycle, we're sort of secondary hosts, I guess. So that can affect a range of different species. So deer, goats, pretty much everything can pick it up. And it's actually through cat feces that you get the oocysts. So what you need, and that's why they advise pregnant women, because the main sort of symptoms, you get flu-like symptoms, but it also can cause abortions. So people that are immunocompromised and definitely pregnant, they advise obviously not touching kitty litter for this reason. Most people, interestingly enough, especially if you've actually got cats, will have some level of immunity to this already, purely just from handling your cat's feces already. You've most likely got immunity, but not to say it's something that you shouldn't try and avoid in the future. So same I guess principles. Make sure you wash your hands after you're butchering really thoroughly, and just from obviously a household cat point of view and everything like that, make sure potentially wear gloves when you're handling kitty litter, but also make sure that you're washing your hands after that too, and trying to definitely keep pregnant women and immunosuppressed people away from cat feces.
Yeah, James touched quite heavily on the domestic cat side of things there, but obviously here in Australia we do have feral cats which act as the definitive hosts and transmit or continue to perpetuate that cycle. And as James said earlier, pretty much all herbivores and I guess humans as well in this instance can be the intermittent hosts, which means basically that we can get toxoplasmosis indiscriminately from being contaminated by cat feces. So this is more common, to be honest, in herbivores, because they're often eating close to the ground and the grass, where these toxoplasma, they're larval stages, which is what James might have said earlier, that oocysts, which is basically all you need to take from that is feral cats do their scat on the ground, that stays moist and wet. It's basically contaminates the soil, grows in the grass, and then those herbivores go and ingest it. We eat the herbivores. Indirectly, we can be, transmitted in a hunting context through ingestion of contaminated herbivores. So it's one of those more rare ones in the hunting context. We just figured we'd touch on it for obviously a bit more of an in-depth discussion and just awareness. But as James was alluding to earlier, it's transmitted quite commonly in a human perspective from domestic cats. So again, hunting is good, feral cats and domestic cats, bad.
So the next topic is hydatid cysts. So this is a type of tapeworm, and the primary hosts are canines, so dogs and wild dingoes. We are intermediate or secondary hosts, and so herbivores pick up they essentially eat the eggs, and then that goes into the organs of herbivores and essentially makes cysts in preparation for then that dog or canine species eating that herbivore, and then so on, completing the life cycle. So we get thrown in there as when we eat, I guess, offal of those species, or we can be a primary intermediate host where if you touch dogs or wild dingoes or stuff like that, obviously they may have eggs in their coats, especially in their feces and stuff like that. So obviously never recommend handling feces, and if you do, obviously all the hygiene parameters around that, make sure you wash your hands thoroughly. But we eat those, so we get it from feces of wild dogs, or we get it from eating like liver and lung and sometimes some of the muscles in deer and wild pigs and that type of thing as well. And then it goes into us and then, sets up cysts in us, which obviously is something we want to avoid. So the big ones there for deer and pigs are they develop large cysts in the liver and lungs. Usually we recommend for that reason not eating offal, especially from pigs. But we also recommend not feeding offal and organs to your dogs, which we know some people do. If you are going to do that, we also recommend regular deworming of your dogs that are receiving this offal and stuff like that to try and prevent infections from hydatid cysts. But yeah, definitely something to keep in consideration when you're handling wild dog or dingo feces, or just wild dogs that you may have shot in general, because obviously those eggs can be just on those dogs. And if you don't wash your hands and have a muesli bar afterwards, you can consume one of those eggs and become part of the life cycle.
The next infectious one that we're going to cover is trichinosis, which was made more popular by our friends over at Meat Eater, Steve Rinella and Giannis Brutalis, who ingested contaminated meat from a black bear. So what we'll identify is that omnivores and carnivores, which eat other animals' meat, us humans obviously being a carnivore in this instance, can get contaminated meat with the larvae basically. We then go and eat meat that essentially isn't cooked properly or cooked to the effective temperature, and those can actually affect humans. Fortunately for us, Trichinella spiralis is in America, and that's more of the virulent sort of the one that affects humans more commonly. Again, that's in their black bears and feral pigs and things like that. Whereas here, it has been detected in Australia, but it's a form of Trichinella called pseudospiralis. So it's just a different variation. This parasitic infection can cause like muscle pain, fever, and swelling. But fortunately for us, cooking wild pork and things like that to 71 degrees kills the parasite. What is important, I guess, with this one is that freezing isn't effective, or not always effective. But again, a much less concerning infectious process here with trichinosis.
So the next two we wanted to touch on, I guess all of these infections are in a way opportunistic in the sense of, they get in, because you haven't washed your hands properly, or you might have cuts on your hand or something like that. This is another one where we're going to be talking about Salmonella and E. coli, and those are ones that come from bacterial contamination of your meat or potentially your hands, and they come from generally if you've sort of opened up the gut cavity and stuff like that. So any body fluids can obviously act as a vector for carrying infection. So blood, milk, urine, like gut contents, feces, anything like that, even hair, can act as, introducing infections. But with Salmonella and E. coli, it's a contaminant from the GIT cavity and feces of animals. So it causes, like even in our food chain, sort of that we've got here in Australia, it causes a lot of problems, and also in abattoirs and all those type of things. So it causes pretty bad diarrhea, vomiting and fever. and is mainly spread from obviously like poor meat handling practices, but also improper cooking temperatures where you don't essentially kill the bacteria when you cook them. So you can get cross-contamination, especially like poultry's got a really bad name from salmonellas and that type of thing, from people using chopping blocks and then using like veggies that they don't like cook as thoroughly through, or, you know, you might cut up some tomatoes on I think like knowledge nowadays, like hopefully this doesn't happen as much as what it used to, but yeah, you know, people having raw chicken on a chopping block and then cutting up, you know, the tomatoes and cucumbers and stuff for the salad, and then people getting salmonella. So cooking is obviously how we're going to prevent that. But also preventing, like another way that we see it sometimes with hunting practices, if you've got like pork or venison or something like that, which are in cryovac bags, and then those bags leak over obviously potentially like other contents in your fridge that you may not be cooking, that can be also a potential source. So making sure that your cryovac bags are done properly, but also, you know, your freezer bags or what Ziploc bags or whatever else you use, making sure that, you know, that bodily content, hopefully it is going to be clean and sterile, but just sort of managing the risk that it could potentially spill over contents in your fridge that you're not going to be cooking.
I think interestingly here, to be honest, most of these diseases and infectious sort of organisms that we've spoken about in today's episode, we've touched on in a basis of wild animals, but it is worth saying that that domestic cattle, domestic pigs have salmonella, E. coli, all these sorts of things. They're natural like commensals, I guess, in the gastrointestinal tract of all of these animals. So, you know, if you get feces from a domestic pig on meat during the abattoir process, it's going to cause, you know, E. coli contamination. They're more robust, rigorous processing facilities and things like that, and the way that they cool meat and check things and have all these contingency plans reduces the risk of that then spreading, I guess, so that by the time it gets to us as the consumer in a domestic market, the risk is pretty low. Obviously, if we, you know, as we spoke about on last week's Butchering and Processing Wild Game Meats podcast, if we've got meat that we shoot from an animal, it's gut shot, that meat is contaminated directly then by a poor shot and then sits in the sun for a little bit longer. Heat and moisture and all these things contribute to further bacterial growth, and then we leave it in our bag for a little bit longer than it should, and then we don't cool it as well as we should, and then when we cryovac it, we allow there to be air in there and blood and all these sorts of things. The contaminant load or the bacterial load of things like salmonella and E. coli, these opportunistic contaminants, is going to be much more exponentially larger than, you know, the domestic industry, I guess. So again, like we've made it sound like, you know, obviously there's all these really concerning diseases in wild animals, which is the case, but there are so many risk factors and things that we can implement to reduce those, things, I guess. So worth noting, but there is a silver lining, which we'll get to shortly.
Just adding to that, and that's why the sort of butchering process podcast that we had last week and making sure that you're chilling meat properly and everything like that is super important, and having those processes nailed down for managing risk from this point of view is because, like what Ayden was saying, like I think of all the stuff that we've talked about here in terms of organisms for potential risk, like E. coli is probably the biggest one that just, you know, it's in feces in every single animal on the planet, including your own, and hence, like, you know, highlights the importance of washing your hands even when you go to the toilet. But so it replicates every 20 to 25 minutes at 25 degrees, whereas at 5 degrees, it replicates every 24 hours. So that obviously highlights, like, not to say that if you shoot an animal and get, you know, like shoot a quartering away or quartering on and it spills some of the gut content and it's sitting in the sun in, you know, essentially that animal's at 37 degrees, probably even getting a little bit hotter if it's a black pig, cooking in the sun. Not to say that you can't take those tenderloins and stuff, but obviously then like washing and drying them. So to try and prevent, you know, trying to wash away some of that contaminant load is going to be really important. But if it's been like 8 hours of it sitting there, well, that's where potentially for like safety reasons, I wouldn't probably eat the tenderloins and, you know, potentially even some of the ribs, and, you know, like you might even have to look at the tops of the hams of like the back legs and stuff like that. And, you know, just take it like by a case by case basis. Because we've obviously outlined all these organisms and everything like that, and, you know, their environments, how you can get them. But like, you need to sort of put some common sense into and sort of real life into, like, these are what, you can catch, and then, try and manage that when you're actually butchering yourself and preparing your own wild game. Cayuga broadheads. Where do I begin? Ayden and I have just absolutely taken to and love these broadheads. He's shooting the 150 grain Zots while I'm shooting the 150 grain pilot cuts with bleeders. There was no other head that I was going to run in Montana on my limited entry hunt than the pilot cut. And I was so happy when I took down the bull of a lifetime. We've teamed up with Cayuga to get 10% off your next order by using the code TWIN10 at checkout. That is TWIN, 10 the number at checkout to get 10% off your next order.
So now that we know about some of these common diseases and infectious organisms that can infect and contribute to our wild game animals, let's convert this last part of the podcast to reducing the risk through various techniques. And I think we'll start off with freezing. And how I like to think of freezing is essentially as slowing down the process of that bacterial growth, I guess, or that pathogen load, is putting a bit of a pause on things. And again, similar to what James was just discussing there with the temperature variances and then the rate of bacterial growth, I like to think of it as we've all been to the airport and seen, some bloke that's in a bit of a rush. He's got his briefcase, business suit on, and he jumps on those sort of horizontal, they're like elevator things that just basically launch people at a rate of 10 kilometers per hour faster than everyone else. Whereas if you just walk alongside them to get to your gate at the airport, you're going to get there, but a lot slower. So I just think of the freezing process as the bacteria is still there. It's just really delayed. And obviously heat in this instance is the rate of replication, or increases the rate of replication. So by freezing things, we don't always kill or eliminate that pathogen load that's there, but it drastically reduces them and prevents them, a lot of the case, from continuing to grow and replicate, until what we're going to talk about in a second here is cooking, and the cooking process, which is actually what kills the organisms in most instances. So this is also important, so it doesn't go directly from freezing. One thing prior to freezing is obviously when we're hanging and cooling meat, we want to get them down to a temperature below 4 degrees. And that's standard in the domestic industry as well as our industry. And fortunately for us, most, fridges, cool rooms, all these sorts of things definitely have those settings, which is vitally important when considering, if you want to hang something for, a week, 3 to 4 days, whatever that time limit may be, you want to do it below 4 degrees.
An important concept, I guess, to also think about is, like, we've obviously talked about how the variabilities in temperature affect the variabilities in replication rate. And I said before, like, at 5 degrees, it's 24 hours for E. coli. At 25 degrees, it's every 20 to 25 minutes. But a big factor to think about there is also, like, what's the potential contamination load, or what's the actual, like, number of organisms that have infected that piece of meat, potentially due to a shot or potentially due to, like, poor handling or whatever. So, like, just say you're pulling the rectum, or the poo tube as Ayden calls it, through the back, and a couple of bits of feces drop out. Well, you're essentially inoculating that tenderloin, I guess, with feces, with poo, which then has E. coli. So if that's just going to sit on a bench at the right temperature, well, that may now have millions, if not billions, of bacteria and E. coli's, which then, like, every 25 minutes, that's going from just say 1 million to 2 billion to 4 billion to 8 billion every 25 minutes. Whereas, like, if you're really clean, you're wearing gloves, you're super clean and everything like that, well, the amount of organisms that are on that tenderloin or anything like that, like I said last time, like, essentially you should think of the meat as sterile until you start introducing infections, unless that animal's shown signs of, being infected by something, which obviously then they're normally going to be sort of wasting away and a bit poorer. But so, like, if you've been really clean and, there is the odd bit, there's actually not that much, there's not that many organisms in, like, on and in the soil and vegetation. Not to say that you should be dragging your back legs and front legs through the dirt and stuff. But like feces and even your hands are a much higher risk of organism contamination of introduction than just say like a bit of dirt or something like that, or the odd bit of grass on your meat. So not to say like that shouldn't like change, like you should just try and be clean as possible. But yeah, you should take into account, like obviously with the cooling process, like how much you think, I guess how much time the bacteria have had to replicate, obviously being the main one here, because like parasites and those type of things aren't going to keep replicating. Like we're a part of their lifestyle. They don't actually replicate in us, most of these, where like they just create cysts and stuff, which obviously impacts our health. So the main ones are like the bacterial ones that are going to keep replicating and going about. So how long has that animal been sitting there and that meat potentially been getting contaminated? And also like how contaminated is that meat? Like what's the number of organisms that you think there? And obviously you don't have any idea, but like is it a gut shot that's then had gut content spill out all the way through the animal, or is it something you shot through the chest and then found 10 seconds later because it ran off and died? It's 8 o'clock in the morning, it's only 10 degrees. And obviously that's like a really good circumstance for having great quality meat with low contamination. So all these factors come into play and should be, a little bit going through your mind when you're thinking about even like how you're going to be hanging your animal. Like obviously, like we've said, we want to get less than 4 or 5 degrees when you're hanging and stuff like that. So like, if like in the shade, it's obviously going to be 10 degrees cooler than in the sun and stuff like that. But if you're in North Queensland, in just say like the wet season, with like near 90% humidity and probably nighttime temperatures of 28 degrees or whatever, like it's probably not the best situation to even at nighttime hang an animal. You know what I mean? Because you're still going to have a lot of bacterial replication going on. So just thinking about all these factors a little bit, and every circumstance is different, as we've said, but at least now, hopefully, you've got some of the sort of key fundamental blocks that are going to fall into place in this picture and deciding what's going to be the best way for, actually processing and preparing your meat after you've got the kill and you've cut it all up and done all the hard work.
If you take anything from this podcast when it comes to freezing, is that freezing does not kill all bacteria. For example, brucellosis, which is that really important one that we touched on at the beginning of the podcast and spoke about as being in feral pigs, it is not killed at all by freezing. Where freezing can be really important is in things like hydatid cysts and things like that with tapeworms and those sort of parasites, is that freezing can kill parasites. So this is where we like to think of different freezing, I guess, temperatures and intervals or duration of freezing, like time. So in order to, make most of our meats safe here in Australia in terms of from parasites, what we like to do is freeze meat at negative 18 degrees. And fortunately for us, most standard freezers have a maximum freeze, which is effectively like their coolest temperature setting of negative 18. So that fits that picture for us. And doing so for around 7 days kills most parasites, as I've mentioned. If your freezer can only go down to like negative 10, then doing so for 10 to 14 days is going to be more effective for that instance and help to kill those parasites. Again, as we're going to discuss in the next little segment, freezing is basically a precursor to help with the process of reducing the disease and reducing replication and bacterial growth, but cooking is king.
So with cooking, the main temperature that I want you guys to think of is 71 degrees. And that's like venison has its own, like venison, we do go a little bit lower, but mainly especially for wild pork, 71 degrees is like the temperature that you need to remember going forward. And luckily for us, like 71 degrees on wild pig is medium, which with like the beautiful fat that pigs have, like you're fine to have your wild pork at a medium. Like you don't need to have it medium rare. Like often, like with wild pork, you're often doing like pulled pork sliders or something like that where you slow cook it for hours. So obviously that's not going to be a problem. Pork roast, you can do pork chops and stuff like that. There's so many different things. And like 71 degrees is going to kill brucellosis, is going to kill trichinosis, is going to kill salmonella and E. coli. And so really like all these bacterial infections that we spoke about, once you've frozen your pork, just say for 2 weeks, which is what I normally do, and cooked it to a central temperature, and that's where it's really important. It's not the outside temperature, it's the central temperature of that bit of meat to 71 degrees is going to pretty much kill everything else, lepto, everything like that. So you then, like when people go, oh, you know, you're going to get tapeworms, you're going to get, you know, all these bacteria and stuff from cooking wild porks. Well, we've pretty much just said to you, like with these simple processes of freezing for 2 weeks and then cooking to 71 degrees, most of the known infections that we can list and talk about here have been rendered, you know, sort of essentially null and void. Like you're not going to get these infections. And so that's why I personally love eating wild pork. And that's sort of the protocol that we especially follow for wild pork. With venison, I guess there is a little bit, because venison don't typically eat, you know, like carrion and dead animals and that type of thing. The risk of a lot of these, so like brucellosis, for example, really, really rare in deer. Obviously, salmonella and E. coli, like that's a contaminant from feces and stuff like that. So you need to take that into account when you're, you know, like butchering and that type of thing, especially like with tenderloins, as we've mentioned. But with our venison, we do it a little bit, because it hasn't got the fat like wild pork, we do cook it a little bit less. So we cook it to like 63 degrees and internal temperature. And what that's doing is, to be honest, like with a lot of these, so like I said, brucellosis isn't really a thing. Salmonella and E. coli definitely are with deer still. But the thing is, with the 63 degrees, which is sort of a rare, like it's not that medium rare like we typically like, to be honest. But with the 63 degree temperature, internal temperature, that means that the outside, in theory, should be higher than that, which salmonella and E. coli being contaminants, mainly through feces, as we've said, you should still be killing off salmonella and E. coli when you're actually like searing off the outside of a backstrap or a tenderloin, for example, like that. But like I said, like I would be cooking it through to 71 degrees if, you know, if you did do that sort of quartering away or quartering on or whatever, for some reason you penetrated the gut cavity, whether it was even in a butchering process, and just making sure that you're completely risk adverse to contracting those diseases.
So there you have it. I guess we've spoke pretty well on reducing the risk factors by freezing and cooking. And essentially, I know we gave that disclaimer at the beginning of the podcast, but if you follow those steps, you can see like it drastically improves the edibility and safeness of the food that you're consuming. So again, if you're cooking food, most pork, for example, to 71 degrees, it's going to make it extremely safe. Where majority of the issue lies and where, you know, there is a lot more variability and things that we can't measure and can't control is actually in the prior stages with the butchering and processing of the meat. So that's, to be honest, where if you stick to these simple strategies, it's going to help you in the long run. And, you know, even while you're learning, it's going to make your food and your eating wild game process a lot more safer. But if you can really, you know, I think even watch videos on how abattoirs run or speak to someone that works at an abattoir and learn how to, you know, make all of your facilities better from, you know, as we discussed on last week's podcast, from preparing at home to going out in the field, choosing the right animal, butchering it strategically, then hanging it strategically, storing it and cryovacuuming it strategically. All these things, it really is an art form, and it's something that you just get better and better and better the more you do and the more that you learn from other people. So hopefully with these combination of podcasts, you've learned a fair bit over the last couple of weeks. It's something that we're extremely passionate about because we really do love eating wild game. You know, we've been the last couple of weeks shooting some wild pork and goat meat. It's just obviously knowing these little things as to making sure that it's safe. And what I will say is that with, you know, cooking methods, for example, like if you know that pork needs to be cooked to 71 degrees at an internal temperature, if it means that you can only eat wild game or wild pigs as pork roasts or, you know, mince or slow cooked pork that is getting, you know, without even being technical, cooked to the shit, you know, you're really cooking it. So what? If that's how, and then you want to save your, you know, pork chop fantasies for when you go out for dinner and you're eating domestic pork where you know the process in theory should be a lot better. But again, if you get anything from this podcast too, it's just that the whole chain of an animal dying to an animal being consumed is so variable because if a transport company that is shipping domestic pork or domestic beef has a slight refrigeration problem, and that refrigeration is 5 degrees warmer than it should be for X amount of period of time because they're stuck in a roadblock or a traffic incident, or their batteries in their portable fridge shit itself, and that pork gets to a certain temperature, and then by the time the restaurant cooks it and they didn't know about this and they cook it to bordering on medium rare because someone put the temperature probe in the very inside and didn't measure, it properly or whatever, and you're eating a contaminated product, then there's a chance to get foodborne illness. So whether it's wild game or domestic meat and animals and products and things like that, the risk is there for everything. But hopefully with this podcast, we've given you guys a few tips and lessons as to reducing the risk. Being so passionate about food and cooking, we have teamed up with Camp Chef. With portable cookware for wherever your travels take you, Camp Chef provides a better way to cook food. Whether in the backyard or the backcountry, shop pellet grills, their cast iron range, or portable cooking systems today. We personally love their large 12-inch diameter skillets and camp ovens for cooking over the coals. Alrighty, so it's come to that point of the show where we're going to get into a few listener FAQs. As always, if you guys want to send them in to us, we've been getting a ton lately on the social media and striving to get back to them as soon as possible. Firstly, as just message replies. I can't tell you, I've been staying up the last few nights while we're hunting here for red deer and stuff, sending out voice messages to all of you legends who are sending in, videos and photos and things like that, asking for my opinion. So again, I try to get to them as quick as possible. Same as if people are sending emails into our email address info@twinelements.com.au with the subject outline FAQ. We will strive to get to them as soon as possible.
Yeah, it's pretty funny. The last couple of days we've been getting up early morning trying to locate stags in the raw and stuff, but we also only get service when we're up on the mountain, so we're trying to help out you guys as much as we can, send quick audio messages at first light and stuff like that. So if you're getting messages at 4:30 in the morning from Ayden and I, trying to answer your questions that you've sent through on Instagram, apologies for the timing, but we're just trying to get back to you as soon as possible so we can hopefully help you guys be successful during this rut and raw. So hopefully you guys are appreciating it, and you're taking a lot away from all these questions that you guys are sending in.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is that if you can, obviously gather, is that one person asks the question, we answer it, but there's 20 people replying to our thing going, oh, thanks for answering that. That helped me so much. So if you think you've got a question that, even is a bit silly or strange or odd or very specific to your situation, I guarantee you it's not. I guarantee you we get, 20 people nearly every podcast saying, great job on that FAQ. I can't tell you how many times I've thought about that as snack options, or when tracking animals, or, whatever the topic may be. As we said, there's such a steep learning curve when it comes to hunting. So these FAQs as a way for us to engage with you guys, our listeners and our viewers on YouTube and followers on social media is awesome, and we're loving it. So hopefully, we can get a few more, but without further ado, this week's first question isn't actually a specific listener question or directed to a specific listener as such, but I have seen variations of this as a vet countless times, I guess. So relating to calicivirus and myxomatosis in rabbits, can we get sick from eating the meat of these affected animals?
Yeah, this isn't a specific listener question, but God, I don't know personally, I don't know about Ayden, but I get this at least probably once a month from people, especially when they release the virus in a new location and it just goes rife. But the short version to this question is no, humans cannot get sick from either calicivirus or the myxomatosis. But there is definitely some considerations. I actually wouldn't recommend eating animals that are showing signs of this, and that's for multiple reasons. So the first one is obviously that animal is essentially wasting away to that virus. They obviously affects their vision and everything like that. It affects, they get a fever, and they essentially it causes hemorrhagic issues inside of them, and then they waste away and die. So obviously from an eating perspective, that animal's going to be pretty poor eating quality, I guess. But the main sort of one, I guess, is the risk of secondary infection. So obviously that animal is going to be fighting, a virus in the form of Calici virus. And so what they can do is actually get secondary bacterial infections. Like I said, a lot of species actually harbour E. coli and Salmonella just as sometimes normal flora in their intestines. And so our body, is essentially working around the clock. Like I said on the last episode, we're a big donut. Our immune system's standing in the way there in our intestines, preventing that bacteria and other infections moving from our gut content into our actual body. And so when a rabbit has myxomatosis, they're going to be, their immune system's going to be suppressed because they're going to be, essentially fighting off with everything they have this Calici virus, which is innately killing them. And so if you go and kill that animal, it's not to say that it hasn't acquired a secondary bacterial infection that has become opportunistic and just gone rife in that animal, because it's like, okay, well, its immune system is busy fighting the Calici virus. It's not going to be able to defend from me as well. So it jumps in there, and then all of a sudden you shoot it with a 22 or a rifle or, whatever, and then you decide to eat it. Well, you've got a higher risk of actually getting a secondary bacterial infection from that animal. And so for the meat quality reason, and also the risk of contracting other infections that can infect humans, I don't recommend eating rabbits with myxomatosis or Calici virus from that point of view, not for the fact that we can actually contract Calici virus or myxomatosis in its own right. The next question has been sent in from Ethan Henkel. So he says, I would love to hear from you lads on buck fever.
So this topic is obviously massive, and something that I'm assuming all of us that are listening, James and I, can obviously relate to this, as having definitely got it in the past and still do to this day, over 25 years of bow hunting and hunting in general. We're going to do this as a future podcast topic in its own right, because managing buck fever is one of the biggest things to really sharpening your learning curve and having more success, especially early on as a hunter, because you can do everything right, and then up until that last moment when you get buck fever, sometimes it is overwhelming and really does, take what should be the best scenario and situation to, something where you bugger the shot, or you do something that ends in the hunt obviously not going your way. So for those that aren't familiar, buck fever, the way I think of it, is essentially when it's like your body's response to preparing for this event that's about to occur, and you get that excited. It's almost like an adrenaline response that's just all encompassing. I know that, when I used to get a deer and get to within bow range, my legs would start shaking, and then I'd try and draw back the bow and settle the pin, and I'd be shaking, and my breathing would be out of control, and all these things. And it's purely the excitement of the hunt, basically just increasing, and you can't get rid of it until, unfortunately, a lot of the time you do something silly, or you shoot over the back of the buck with the bow, or you can't even get your rifle sight on the animal. And it's not only once the hunt's completed and you've sort of got this devastating come down that your adrenaline response then crashes, and you sort of sit there going, oh shit, what happened, and how did that happen again? And unfortunately, it's one of those things that unless you keep putting yourself in the situation and learning from it, you don't really, I guess, surpass that until you get to the point where, for me, for example, again here, spoiler alert, next podcast is going to be on chital deer hunting, because I've just had an awesome trip up in the basalt wall country of North Queensland hunting for chital stags and doing a bit of scouting for spotted safaris. But I would say that I very rarely get buck fever anymore, because I feel like I've worked out the process of what I have to do, and compartmentalized every single step that I need to do to effectively shoot the chital deer or the deer. And then it's not until that animal's down on the deck, humanely and ethically, dispatched, that my body then freaks out. And then I start thinking of, holy shit, how big is it? Is it a mature stag? Is it the stag I got? Did I get that on video? Whatever factors are there. I think, to answer your question a little bit, Ethan, if I had to say one thing, one of the biggest killers when it comes to buck fever is the moment that animal starts coming in, making a direct beeline towards you. You see it with the whitetail guys in the US all the time. And I think people enter this thought into their head of, I'm going to shoot this, or, oh shit, I'm going to have to drop it off at the taxidermist, or its horns or antlers or whatever are going to look awesome on my wall. The second you have that thought, I would nearly guarantee you that the stalk is done. Like, I'm laughing, but the amount of times I've thought, oh, that will look good on the wall, or I can't wait to measure him, I can't wait to send someone a photo of this stag. Your body does stupid things. You stop concentrating on the little 1% things that you have to do perfectly. And you're doing 100 of them to get to 100% perfect to shoot this animal, because they've got so many factors going against us. So being able to control buck fever, obviously then, is massive in making sure that we can obviously like implement these hunting strategies and effectively take the animals. But I'm sure James has something to contribute as well. But I'm like very passionate about it, as you can tell, because again, similar to you, Ethan, I've suffered from it before, but it is one of the best things that, you know, when you do sort of not master it, but get used to it and work out how to control it and then enjoy it after the success of seeing that animal hit the deck. It's the adrenaline rush afterwards is like next level, and the celebration and the surge of energy that goes through your body is really, really cool once you've done everything right.
Yeah, I think for me, and like there's so much in it, like we've said, we plan to do a podcast on this in the future. So stick around, Ethan. There'll be a lot more in detail answer to this. But I think for me, I've never really struggled with buck fever. I've been pretty fortunate that I get like the adrenaline dump afterwards, and whether that's been experienced or whatever, I'm not sure. But I think my problem is, and I don't know, I wouldn't call this typical buck fever, is I think that the animal, in the sense of like not being able to hold the pin and shaking and all that type of stuff, like that massive adrenaline dump before, with me, I think it's I like tell myself that the animal's like getting away, and so I sort of rush shots and everything like that, like where the animal's just standing there broadside at 20 meters, like doesn't know I'm here, but I'm like, oh, quick, you got to shoot and stuff like that. And then sometimes you don't hit them exactly where you want to, and so on and so forth. But I think one of the biggest things, I'll just say two things on managing buck fever, and maybe I've found the cure, or maybe it's just, it's never really affected me, but definitely, like for me, I know when I'm like stalking something I really, really, really want to shoot, and I can feel like my excitement level is getting up, I'll actually stop halfway through the stalk, close my eyes and take a couple of breaths. Like, it sounds a bit weird, and I've had like Ayden behind me filming and stuff like that before, and it's like, what are you doing? Like, especially when you're like halfway through, moving across an open area with the chital stag and stuff, like it's not the right time. But it's also like, well, like what Ayden said, you lose your concentration for 2 seconds, you take a step too quick, the hind sees you or whatever, or a doe sees you, and then they run off, and that's it. So it's like, when I can really, really, really feel that I'm getting excited, then I'll close my eyes, take a breath, and try and settle those nerves. And the second thing, I think this is like the kryptonite that has actually, for me, probably done the biggest thing. And that is like, I actually tell myself, like, I'm like, you're an idiot. Like, there is no way you're going to shoot this buck. Like, I just get in my own head, like, so bad. It's like, this stag's coming in. It's like, mate, you've never shot a stag this big in your life. Like, what makes you think that you're going to be able to shoot this one? Like, there's no way that you can shoot it, all this stuff. And like, almost like downplay the fact that it's like, and it doesn't take you out of the game or the situation, but just doesn't let for me anyway, I've found, it doesn't let my emotions and like that adrenaline get in the way, because I'm already like, well, this isn't going to happen. So then you sort of can't get excited. Whereas I think like what Ayden was saying about before, where it's like, oh shit, here comes that big buck, like that buck I've had on trial cameras for 6 months and trying to shoot or whatever. And like, you've been watching him for 3 years and he's walking into your rattle or whatever. And then you get all excited and shoot him in the antler or shoot over his back or whatever. I think it's the fact that you start like letting your lust and your emotions get in the way, that you then get that, massive adrenaline dump. Whereas I find like, if you go, like there's no way that you're going to actually get this animal, this boar or whatever, then, and in combination with that, like closing your eyes and taking a couple of breaths, you can really sort of control that adrenaline. And like, obviously experience, I'd like to think that Ayden and I are fairly experienced hunters, but like obviously experience does help. But even then, like there's still, like we see some critters all the time that we're like, holy shit, that is a, proper one, that's a once in a lifetime thing. Like even going over to the US and stuff and having these sort of once in a lifetime hunts, like you definitely need to learn how to control it, and it does come with experience. But having some of these little tips and tricks and stuff, for me, like breathing and also just like the negative thoughts, I guess, really, really have helped in some dire situations when sort of my adrenaline levels, I wouldn't call them necessarily buck fever, but definitely when the adrenaline levels were rising.
I think one last thing I want to mention here is, because James sort of touched on not letting your emotion take control. And I find that when I do start, because it's inevitable that you're going to look at that deer, and for example, this chittle deer that I'll do the podcast on next is, you know, I the second I saw it, I went, holy crap, that is one of the biggest chittle deer I've ever seen. And that's just not subjective, that's objective. It was one of the biggest chittle deer that I've seen. It'd be in the top, you know, X amount. And to then bring yourself back to that, it's like similar to what James said. I was like, okay, it's a kilometre away. I've got to do X, Y, Z to get into range. And then once I got into range, if I felt myself getting more excited, like, oh, he's only got to stand up and then I'm going to shoot him, I just then actually come back to what I call the shot sequence. And this for me is like a very specific list of things that need to take place, that I, instead of thinking, oh, look how big his antlers are, oh, is that an extra point, oh, his cape looks awesome, I can't wait to send this photo to Macca or whatever, instead of thinking those things that, you know, may not ever happen, I start thinking of, how's the grip on my bow, I'm going to clip my release aid on, have I ranged every tree that I can, okay, when he stands, I'm going to gently draw. But not only am I going to draw, I'm going to really push hard with my left hand, which is holding the bow, and push that forward. And then I'm going to pull back and get so tight on my wall that I'm like locked off like an anchor. And then I'm going to look through and I'm going to get my bubble and make sure that the bubble on my bow is sitting perfectly in the middle. And then when my sight hits the target, I'm going to aim for that dot that I've envisaged for the last half an hour of waiting for that stag to stand. And it's not until you start doing that and going, you know, there is so many little factors to get and do and achieve until this animal is dead on the deck, that I think by doing that and going through that shot process and shot sequence, it really does reduce that target panic, but buck fever, because you go, rightfully so, like the wind only has to swirl once and that deer's out of here. So again, hopefully, Ethan, a lot of that topic has answered your question. We will do a full podcast episode on it because, again, as you can tell, we love talking about it. It is something that affects, I'd nearly guarantee, every hunter at some point in their learning curve.
With unmatched quality, performance and reputation, Aimright International is our go-to for spear guns, wetsuits and fins. Whether it be coral trout, wahoo or dogtooth tuna, Aimright has you covered on or in the water. Check them out today at their website.
The last question for today's episode comes in from a listener, and unfortunately I've actually screenshot this. I replied to him on Instagram, and I've actually cut off his name in the screenshot. And I tried to go back through, but it was from a couple of weeks back, and to be honest, I haven't been able to find it just with the inundation of messages we've been getting lately. But hopefully you hear this and know who you are. We're obviously thankful for your contribution. So he's just said, any tips on getting some practice in with the bow when living in a residential area?
Yeah, so this is a spicy topic in the sense of, like, it depends on, are we talking an apartment in a sky-rise building? I'm assuming we're just going to be talking about like in the suburbs here. But to be honest, like, and this, I guess, comes back, like Ayden might have a different answer to me. I'd personally recommend, like, if you're in the suburbs and stuff like that, if you thought you had, like, you know, if you're out in the cutout on the side of a hill and you've got like a brick wall with like dirt behind it and stuff like that, then I would think that would be, you know, okay. But if you've just got like a fence between you and your neighbor, I mean, you can go and ask them for, you know, permission and stuff and just see what they say, especially like if they've got little kids or dogs and stuff running around. Like, I guess you could get like a couple of bits of, you know, like 2 meter by 2 meter sort of ply, and then stack them on each other to prevent arrows going through and stuff. But I mean, we're talking about that 1 in 100,000 or 10,000 arrow, not, you know, hopefully you're a bit better shot than a 1 in 100 arrow, you know, missing the target or whatever, or like you go to shoot and you sort of you're halfway through your draw and your hinge goes off, or your calipers on your trigger release goes off, or your D-loop snaps or something like that, and you're halfway through a draw cycle and it sends the arrow like over the back fence or whatever. And I mean, like, especially even if you're shooting field tips, like, I mean, you just have to hit someone in the wrong spot to do some serious damage at the wrong time, or shoot something through someone's window or whatever. So for me, I would recommend going out to a bow club. And like I said, like if you've got a brick wall or something like that, like I know we actually used to shoot in our backyard, but we had like a 5 meter high brick wall that we could sort of use. So like the way that we drew, like we're not aiming up at the sky, like it'd have to be, I don't know how we'd get out of there, and that's sort of why we did it. But we're always like assessing the risk. So if you've got a really, really solid backdrop, I'd feel confident doing it. If you're just shooting in your garage and stuff like that, which like I know that people do, there's a risk that the arrow goes into your actual house with your loved ones in there, potentially, if you've, missed the target or whatever. So I'd probably advise staying away from it. I'd probably advise, and I know you want to obviously practice as much as possible, and I respect you for that, but just from a safety point of view, like I'd be trying to find someone as close as you can with a little bit of land, like even an acre or something like that you can, set up a range at and shoot safely and effectively out there, or joining a bow club. Like there's heaps of ranges and great clubs all around Australia that obviously support that community, and they don't really cost much to join, and like I'd say that most places, like maybe not inner city Melbourne, but most clubs would have most major sort of rural towns would have a range or a club. And if you're sort of more rural, then you're only 5 minutes from the edge of town anyway, and can go and set up at someone else's place. So I'd probably try and avoid shooting unless you've got a really, really solid backdrop in town. But it'd be interesting to hear what Ayden has to say about it.
No, I think you've done that pretty concisely. My biggest things without like going into them would be communication. So just, obviously speak to the neighbours. Make sure there's no kids or dogs or anything like that. Again, just ensuring that safety is the key consideration here, reducing the risks, whether it be through backdrops and things like that, or altogether reduce the risk, don't shoot in your backyard, and just put the effort into going to a range or a club, or otherwise chat to a mate or someone with, a little bit of land and a paddock and a hay bale, and you can put your target in front of, or a creek bed. There's honestly hundreds of different scenarios and options out there. So just, we're in the 2025 year, and hunting and bow hunting in particular have a pretty bad publicity issue at the best of times. So all we need is one errand arrow going through, the wrong fence or something, and it doesn't even have to injure anyone, but it's more of the actual, in theory behind it. We just don't need it, unfortunately. But again, I really do appreciate the fact that you want to get out there, be doing some practice with the bow and stuff like that. Bow range or archery club or something would be my suggestion. We do also have plenty of 3D clubs and competitions and things here in Australia as well.
Well, that wraps up another podcast, Legends. A bit shorter than usual, but definitely packed full of information. Like, I know that you guys are going to get so much out of this. These are practices that Ayden and I have been sort of going through for years and refining, I guess. Obviously, having the veterinary background, we've probably been able to shed a little bit more light on managing risk with eating wild game and the potential infections that you can get from the diseases that we see. So hopefully you've taken a lot away from this podcast. But as you're listening to this podcast, Ayden and I, luckily enough, obviously have taken off some time for the rut, and we're away hunting some red deer. So hopefully we're getting some incredible footage to capture with you guys, and potentially a few kills on the deck. So I'm sure you guys will be looking forward to seeing that on our YouTube channel. But what we will have starting up shortly on the YouTube channel is some of our Northern Territory adventures, where we've been hunting buffalo, bantang and boars. So what we're going to do is drop those films every Wednesday evening at the normal time of 6 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Times. There is so much action, live footage in these films. Like, they're absolutely incredible. We had an amazing time hunting with Dingo Creek Safaris up there for the bantang and boars. And we've just captured some absolutely incredible footage, and especially the wildlife. Like, it just has to be seen to be believed. So we can't wait to share that with you guys, and we know you guys are going to love it.
Speaking of YouTube, if you've been living under a rock and haven't heard, we are launching and have been doing our 20k YouTube subscriber giveaway for some time now. It is getting close to that magical number, which we're extremely excited to give away. There's literally thousands of dollars worth of prizes from some amazing brands. The guys that support us have generously offered their products to you, our listeners and consumers of all of our media. So up for grabs. I'm not going to go through all of it, but some of the things that I'm most excited for you guys to have are, if you're a bow hunter, there's an option 4 site up for grabs. There's knives, there's broadheads, there's care packages with coffee, different caffeine pouches, supplements from Atlas Wild. Lower Boots are throwing in a brand new pair of Rangers. We've got knife sharpeners and then a ton of gear from Venture Hunting Outdoors. So again, all the details are on that post. To enter, simply head over to our YouTube channel, find the pinned giveaway video. It's basically what's called our 2025 bow hunting highlight reel from, as what James was just saying, the Northern Territory Adventures. From there, you simply have to, number 1, like the video. Number 2, comment on the video. Basically, there's plenty of examples there now, but tell us your dream hunt in 25 words or less. We want to hear what species you want to hunt, where you want to do it, who with, all these sorts of things. And lastly, the point of this giveaway, please make sure that you've subscribed to our YouTube channel. As I said, we are nearing 20,000 YouTube subscribers, and really keen to continue sharing all of our adventures and media with you guys on that platform.
Well, that wraps up another episode of the Twin Elements podcast. I know you guys are going to love this because we have had so many questions in our hunting life about this, eating wild game. So many people, us eating offal all the time, and just how we make our wild game as safe as we possibly can. So if you've enjoyed this podcast, please share it with a friend, try and get the word out there, but also please continue to support the podcast by subscribing, doing a review and rating the podcast. It really does help it get spread as a sort of suggested podcast to other people that love the outdoor field. But we also really appreciate you guys sharing it with your family and friends. So if you can get out there and spread the word about the Twin Elements podcast, it just gives us a bigger platform in order for us to share our information, but also share our hunting stories and hunting camps, which we want to bring you guys along with in the future. So we've got a couple of live podcasts that we've sort of recorded in hunting camps about the rut, and obviously Ayden said the next one up is going to be his successful chital hunting story, which is an awesome story. It was an absolute magnificent stag. So you guys can look forward to that one next week. But once again, we just really appreciate all the support as this podcast grows. And we really appreciate, you guys sending in all your love, sending in all your questions, and sharing it with your family and friends.
And please continue to share your successful hunts. I love nothing more than when you legends send us in, a story from a successful hunt and reference to a podcast episode or a lesson that you may have learned from us, or just helped refine sort of your hunting strategies. And there's no better time to be implementing all of these things than during the fallow rut, red deer raw, or whatever else you may be hunting in Australia or abroad. And take care. We'll see you on the other side of an episode.
From us here at Twin Elements, thank you so much, guys, and we'll catch you on the next episode of the Twin Elements podcast.